Hello everyone, welcome to the Oxford Martin School and thank you for coming on this lovely day, or not quite as nice as it's been for the last few days. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to a lecture, African Transformation and Economic Development in the Age of Doubt, which is given by Carlos Lopes. Carlos is a very good friend of the school and has spent quite a lot of time here. It's always nice to welcome someone here who has a new and fascinating book out. It's even nicer when that book was actually written in this building, just in fact in the offices across there. So we're particularly proud of this. Carlos is professor in the Mandela School of Public Governance in the University of Cape Town and is a visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Carlos has had a long and very distinguished career, and I can't mention everything, but he led, for example, several United Nations institutions, including the Economic Commission for Africa from 2012 to 2016, and has many other links with this country, including being a associate fellow at Chatham House. So, Carlos, with no further ado, let me invite you to the lectern to give your lecture.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be back in this city and at this school. Thank you, Charles, for the introduction. I'm very pleased to present to you my new book that was, as mentioned, written here in 2017. And it was an attempt at the time to basically structure some of my thoughts after the experience of working at the Economic Commission for Africa for 4 years and being an actor in transformation processes, discussions in Africa, being very close to the African Union and trying to influence their agenda in different ways. Very happy and excited that now African Continental Free Trade Area has just been signed last year, and the ratifications have reached a point where it can enter into force. This is a battle of many decades, and it's really something that can change the landscape quite significantly for reasons that I will mention to you. So the book is basically an attempt to try to revisit why Africa, after more than doubling its GDP over the past 20 years and making progress in areas such as education and health, improving governance systems, creating the world's second most attractive region for foreign direct investment, reducing poverty slightly despite the explosion of the demography and rapid urbanization, why this continent is still very much in lack of real economic and social transformation. Partly, industrialization, we know, is the necessary step towards economic and social transformation, and Africa has missed many opportunities to accelerate industrialization. It's not like the continent doesn't have any experience with industrialization. In fact, Africa produces right now about $500 billion worth of goods from the industrial sector. But if you take into account the size of the continent and the size of significant developments that took place in other regions of the world in industrialization, certainly we can consider that Africa lacks industrialization. Not only because of its importance in terms of modernizing the social and economic systems of production, but also because this is an indication that Africa has been very slow in structural transformation, and that has implications in terms of absorbing its huge youth bulge. And as a result, you have problems of employment, you have problems of the economy responding to the needs. It is important to mention from that angle that industrialization is not just manufacturing. Manufacturing is obviously a very important dimension of it, but it's more about modernizing the economic systems. And that includes modernizing, but also formalizing the economic systems. If you have a reality that is mostly dominated by informal transactions, obviously it's much more difficult to talk about policy proposals that are based on formal economies, like, for instance, fiscal policy, taxation, etc. So the book tries to revisit these dilemmas, try to understand the ecosystem that exists right now in most African countries, obviously taking into account the diversity of the continent, because you have countries that are more industrialized than others. And it tries also to bring the debate to the industrial policy debate of today, which is a debate about how the technological impact is going to change the rules of the game. With robotization, with automation, machine learning, it's going to be much more difficult to sustain certain types of jobs that were based in an equation where labor costs were very important. Now labor costs are a dimension that is becoming less and less relevant in some of the policy decisions that you have to make. And as a result, industrial policy from the perspective of certain specialists is now much more difficult and much more complex to undertake. For instance, let's take into account the notion of productivity. The terms productivity and performance are commonly used within academic and commercial circles. They are, however, rarely adequately defined or explained. Indeed, they are often confused and considered to be interchangeable, along with terms such as efficiency, effectiveness, profitability. Measurement and improvement regimes are often built without a clear understanding of what is being measured and what needs to be improved. This can be regarded as simply a pragmatic approach to improvement or a missed opportunity to fully understand and therefore optimize important factors relating to competitiveness and success. Now imagine all of this being much more complex when a lot of the dimensions of productivity, effectiveness, and efficiency are influenced by algorithms rather than what we used to attribute to human interventions. Manufacturing value addition, for instance, which is the way economists measure the contribution of manufacture to GDP, are now very much questioned as a good measurement. There are some authors like Danny Roderick or Joseph Stiglitz that talk about premature deindustrialization, where they try to identify factors that are influencing the peak period for industrial possibilities of manufacturing adding to GDP, becoming much more earlier in stages of development of countries. And therefore, African countries as latecomers to industrialization will be the subjects of this premature deindustrialization possibilities. In the book, I try to challenge that. I try to demonstrate that, in fact, there are lots of negatives that are associated with industrialization, but there are also some positive elements that Africans can build on. The book tries to go beyond economic arguments alone, even if we can go quite a great deal in detail on issues relating to industrialization, because it's a strong proponent for structural transformation. The book has tried to go into the politics, into the social dimensions as well, and it tries to increase our understanding of the meaning of transformation from an historical perspective, all the way to revisiting some concepts that started in the heart of Europe in the 18th century when industrial revolution took place, or to the contemporary discussions of today. There are 8 challenges that are identified as the most relevant for transformation. They range from the choice of development policies, the reforms of the policy space, the respect for diversity, which is quite evident in a continent with more languages than any other in the world and more cultural diversity than any other in the world. The issues relating to agricultural productivity, revitalizing the social contract and what its meaning is when we revisit the concept of sustainable development, taking climate change into account, and finally the last chapter is about harnessing the relationship between Africa and China. It's picked on purpose because this partnership is going to define, to a large extent, the future of the continent's relations with the rest of the world. The controversial link between democracy and development is not avoided in the book. I try to instill the debate based on the African intellectual contributions to this debate. I avoid categorizations that are favored outside Africa, such as liberal versus socialist systems and the like. The tendency today is for the division between authoritarian-minded developing states and open democracies, which unfortunately often produce neo-patrimonial or rent-seeking elites. And I try to divide the countries in Africa more or less in these two categories, the reformers and the rent-seekers. I go into the detail about how democracies like Botswana and Mauritius are sine qua non for development, what we can learn from them. And the book also assesses some other aspects that are influencing our politics, like, for instance, the Washington Consensus, exposing in the book the internal tensions and arguments that contributed for the changes that occurred and made the Millennium Development Goals possible, basically moving from the period 2 decades, 80s and 90s, where most of the discussions on Africa were on prescriptive policies, structural adjustment policies, towards an era after the 2000, where the Millennium Development Goals became the mantra, and what was the most important contribution from the Millennium Development Goals discussion was that we moved out of prescriptive policies into goals. And obviously with different ways of attaining those goals becoming possible, but not as much as probably we think it was, and the book goes into the detail. Starting by revisiting the Washington Consensus orthodoxy, looking into how the internal debates of the institutions that promoted it, like the IMF, the World Bank, were taking shape, and how, for instance, the evaluation department of the IMF was so critical of the ways and intellectual attitudes of the IMF staff became possible, and how Africans have to take advantage of these opportunities, windows of opportunity, where there are doubts, where there are discussions, to basically assert a bit more their interests and create more policy space for themselves. In Africa, the weak performance of structural adjustment policies is not questioned. For instance, the continent GDP grew only 1% between 79 and 92 compared to countries in East Asia and the Pacific regions about 5% during the same period, precisely because they were not playing with the same policy recommendations and were actively promoting industrial policies. I think after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, all the neoclassical notions of market efficiency are now being questioned more openly. The choice of a Taiwanese, then Justin Lin, a former military man who joined mainland China after being born in and making a good career in Taiwan, to become chief economist of the World Bank, was half a surprise. It was in fact a good indication that the model of development of his country, based on the role of the state as we know, China, was now welcome in the discussions within the Washington circles. It's true that Justin Lin did not last too long as chief economist of the World Bank, but his mark and his print is very much there. The book reviews also the point of view of several other economists, like Thomas Piketty, author of the monumental Capitalism in the 21st Century, that analyzes the deepening of inequalities in modern societies, tries to translate that debate into African inequality issues that are quite significant. Or someone like Olivier Blanchard, which was a former chief economist of the IMF, 2008-2015, who believed that the pendulum had moved from the more neoliberal traditional ways of perceiving the market to giving a much more prominent role to the state as a regulator, but also as a facilitator of some of the structural transformation processes. Tried to compare some of the African developments to countries outside Africa, because that's the best way to demonstrate that Africans are often shortchanged. Like, for instance, if we look into what happened and the way Ukraine or Ireland was treated, it was very different from the way we treat the same African countries in terms of the list of conditionalities, the type of policy recommendations, etc. So it's very important to bring this type of comparisons. And I think all of this is basically to try to give the impression that we need to ensure agency on the part of the Africans. To ensure agency, Africans have to demonstrate that they really are prepared for what the book considers to be the three pillars of the current transformation processes in the continent. They have to be much more ambitious, much more sophisticated, and much more coherent. Now, on the ambitions, it's basically about bringing on board the mega trends, like the mega trend on demography and the mega trend on the climate, that are going to oblige every country to set a vision that is not just based on what they know right now, but what may happen, which is quite phenomenal in many respects, but also being capable of inspiring, particularly the young people, because the average age in continent right now is 19 years old. Inspire people to actually contribute to that vision. And only reform-minded leaders really are in this sort of frame of mind. Otherwise, you will not have that. Sophistication is because we are now exposed to value chains that have become all global. So if you want to do anything that is prominent in terms of economic development, particularly if we talk about industrialization, but it's also relevant for other areas like services or agriculture, one needs to know the value chains globally and needs to know what are the niches of opportunities that one given country has. It cannot be too many, so this is about focus, it's about priority setting, and this is the most difficult part, because most countries believe that they have to do everything. It is very difficult to go and try to revisit the concept of comparative advantage. Some believe that comparative advantage is static, is what the earth has given a country, either its geolocation or its riches in terms of natural resources, or some neighborhood that facilitates certain types of economic activities. Those are all static elements. You can create your own comparative advantage by being daring, aggressive, but also sophisticated. So the book goes into some examples like, Vietnam creating a naval industry out of nothing, or, different countries doing things that were not really in anybody's mind. They created their own comparative advantage out of this sophistication. And then coherence, because the time where planning and the way management of economic activities was shaped based on sectoral policies is over. It's not that sectoral policies have disappeared, but to make a difference today, you need to have a certain number of very well-conceived but very few priorities that are national undertakings. And from those national undertakings, then everybody has to identify what is their collaborative dimension to make them happen. And countries that are really making it happen, and in the discussion we can talk about some of them, they have this capacity to make their machinery coherent, and not just the state machinery or the administration of the state, but also bringing the economic actors, private sector, and others into the picture to make this coherence, sort of a national undertaking. So, if I had to metaphorically synthesize the book, it could have been with the title that I chose and the publisher refused, because it felt that it was not commercial enough. And the title was, smooth seas don't make skillful sailors. Because of the difficulties that the continent is facing, you can actually be quite skillful. And if you are, you are a winner in terms of transformation. It's not given to everybody. It's not given to every country. So a few will succeed. Most will not. But that's what makes the whole process very dynamic. And that's why, I wrote the book, so we can have the challenges, we have the dilemmas, and at the same time, some of the solutions that can respond to the most difficult debates that are taking place around each one of the dilemmas. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Carlos, which gives us plenty of time for discussion. Who would like to go first with a question to Carlos? And lady over there.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. You mentioned the Millennium Development Goals as a real game changer, and it made me wonder what your thoughts were about the Sustainable Development Goals and whether they're going to be another game changer, a continuation, a positive, or a barrier to this development.
Well, I did say that the Millennium Development Goals were extremely important to move us from the prescriptive policies period to, sort of a more open policy space. Because shifting the debate towards goals gave the latitude for different countries to select how they would reach those goals. But there are three difficulties with the Millennium Development Goals that are important to mention if we are going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. The first issue is that they were not universal. So it was still a compact of sorts between developed countries giving money or support to developing countries to do the right thing. And the compact worked in the following way. You deliver good governance, meaning countries that are going to receive that support, developing countries. You deliver good governance and we'll support you to attain these goals. And the goals were attained. Actually, they were surpassed universally, but mostly due to the excellent performance of about two countries, China and India, as we know. Because of their demographic size, they made all the goals being attained. The second problem with these goals is that it translated universal defined, not universal application, universally defined targets to national realities. And that is completely unfair. It's like asking, I'm going to use a metaphor, it's like asking a marathonist to run with a sprinter. You see, you have a country that has to reduce poverty by half, but let's say it has 8% of poor, running at the same time as the other country that has to reduce poverty by half, but has 80% of poor. So reducing 40% of your population is not the same as 4%. So, but we basically apply these rules as if the countries were all the same, and obviously they are not the same. And this is particularly important because Africa, obviously coming from a much lower base, was set by this definition to fail. So it was not possible almost for countries in Africa to succeed because they had a long way to go. And even if their level of effort was superior, and when I was in the Economic Commission for Africa, we made the statistics of efforts for the MDGs implementation rather than attaining the targets. And then out of the 20 most impressive performances, about 15 were African. But, they were not given any credit for it. So that was the second problem. The third problem is that the Millennium Development Goals were based on an assumption that was still coming with basic needs in mind. It was mostly about making sure that the social is fixed rather than real transformation. For instance, what you will find in the Sustainable Development Goals is very much akin to structural transformation as defined by the economists. You have like infrastructure is there, domestic resource mobilization is there, you have even support for industrialization there. But all of this was absent from the Millennium Development Goals. So it's important just to mention this because it was a good effort because it changed us from prescriptive to more policy space, but it was not enough an effort. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals have gone too far in the pendulum in the other direction. Because of the success of the Millennium Development Goals to a large extent, the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals are unattainable. And any expert in a specific area of the 17 areas will tell you, my area is unattainable. It's aspirational. It's so aspirational that is like you reading the Bible or the Quran. It's not possible. We are not going to, in 15 years, finished with all diseases, all the problems of education on earth, all poverty. The slogan is, leave no one behind. I mean, very nice, but that's an ideology. That's not really a target. And I don't think it is going to be possible. Now, we have inbuilt a second problem. Because the aspirations are so high, you have created a discussion about the truth that really bothers me because more and more people, they see international organizations and state and governments organizations as proclaiming these things that are not attainable. And then this creates frustrations. And we have not really calculated the risk of creating expectations that cannot be met. And I think that is really a big problem. And then the third problem that I see with the Sustainable Development Goals is that the Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to be this time universal, meaning it's as much for Sweden as it is for Burkina Faso. But is it going to work like that? Obviously, what we can expect is that we'll have reports prepared by UN agencies for Burkina Faso. But who is going to produce really a report for Sweden? I don't even dare mention the US. So this is going to come to the fore. It's not yet there, it's coming to the fore. And last but not least, every single international agency, not just UN or international financial institutions, even big NGOs, every single international organization is faced with decreased funding. To justify, and now I'm being a bit cynical, you forgive me, to justify what they do, which is the best of intentions, obviously, they need more resources than what they have right now. So the only way they can attract the attention of the public at large is by demonstrating how bad their specific area of concern is. So you have these aspirations that are going all the way to the top, and then the people that are in charge saying it's going so bad because they need the money to attain the aspiration. So this gap is going to be very difficult to manage.
Carlos, can I ask you a question? And it's about a narrative you hear, quite a negative narrative about South Africa. And you touched upon it a bit in your talk. And that is that the way large areas continent develop is by utilizing the comparative advantage of low wages. And argument is South America did it, Asia did it. And then a negative bit is that Africa has missed that boat, that automation, especially in Asia, South America, means that South Africa can't use its advantage in that. Do you think there's truth in that narrative? And if there is, how will South Africa be able to develop?
I think there is truth in it, obviously, because we are entering a stage of the industrial systems where machine learning is occupying a lot of functions that were previously occupied by humans. But it's still very expensive. And part of the research about job losses due to automation has actually been done here at Oxford Martin School. So I had the privilege of going through what has been produced. And I'm very familiar with the debate. I was a member of the Global Commission for the Future of Work of the ILO, which, by the way, is co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Sweden and the President of South Africa. And this is very interesting because both of them are now, of course, in leading positions in their countries, but were trade unionists in the past. So they kind of have this background. And we can say, one of them has become a big capitalist too, but that's... What I think is interesting in this debate is to not confuse how we measure costs across the world with how we measure costs in a given economy in, let's say, an African country. Because obviously, if you are talking about the world, what serves as reference point is the most productive in the world. And therefore, the labor costs are going to be measured against that level of productivity. And Africans, being latecomers, will not fare well in that comparison. But this comes with one advantage. Lots of disadvantages, but one advantage. Amongst the disadvantages, just to start, is the fact that obviously we cannot imitate the industrialization that others have done because those conditions are no longer available. It's not just the labor costs. It's the intellectual property regimes. It's the regulatory systems that are in place right now, like certifications of health, environment, and you name it. It's the fact that trade conditions have changed dramatically. It's the fact that supply chains have become extremely complex. We can go on with the list all the way to Africa has less infrastructure, Africa has less skilled labor, and so on. So those are the disadvantages. We cannot do import substitution like Latin America did. We cannot do export-oriented industrialization like Southeast Asia and China did as the main vehicle for industrialization. But there is one thing we can do. Look at our demographic dimensions. The population is going to increase to 2 billion by 2050. Most of the growth that Africa has experienced in the last 20 years has been propelled by internal consumption, precisely because of these demographics. Now, this first line of consumption that people have when they have a bit of income is going to be used mostly on low manufacturing value addition products and also on agro-processed products. This is very interesting because if you create a space within Africa that is protected with some tariff regimes like the free trade area that is being established right now, you have possibilities for agro-processing that are immense because Africans will consume first, your pasta, your yogurt, and you name it, before, they go for more expensive things. And in terms of the labor costs themselves, there are certain types of industries where it's still competitive to go human rather than full automation. You can do part of automation. Full automation is still a bit too expensive. This is going to offer a window of opportunity that is very short in time. So Africans have to rush and occupy that so they can scale up quickly. But it is still possible to do it. And some countries are doing it with success that is mixed, but it's happening.
Thank you. I should have reminded people that we webcast this, so when you ask a question, do remember your broadcast. Sam and then David.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned another mega trend as climate change in relation to your framework of sophistication and coherence. Where do you see that elements of preparedness, response, and opportunity in relation to climate change within the continent?
I think it's in the first element, vision. If you don't include the two most important megatrends in the continent, demographic and climate, you are going to fail. And I'll tell you how much the link with industrialization is powerful. Most of the debates on climate change tend to, box the Africans on the discussion about adaptation. And obviously there's nothing wrong with adaptation. Most of the things that are very difficult to deal in terms of policy debates is because it's not necessarily wrong. It's like the SDGs, it's not necessarily that it's wrong. It's the nuance. And of course, adaptation is good. But Africans should not limit themselves to adaptation alone. Because if they are going to now industrialize as latecomers, they'll have to do it differently. They cannot do like the others with smokestacks and basically doing it the old-fashioned way. Africans can generate power from renewables at a cost that is matching fossil fuel, if not going to take advantage because it's going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. No other region in the world, when they industrialized, had this luck. That's a luck. So we can go straight to green energy. So that's just the energy element. Then we know now that you can build in a completely different way than what you used to build before. You can build in a sustainable way. You don't need to imitate the way factories were conceived in the past. You can go straight into a much more modern and sustainable way of constructing. The same for infrastructure, and the list goes on. So climate has to become part of this equation. That's why in the vision, if leaders, but not just leaders, if a country does not have that type of ambition, it's going to miss the boat.
Thank you. David.
David McDonald, Wild Crew. Carlos, you mentioned various attributes and aspects and opportunities about Africa that are special. And one of the things about that continent is its environment and indeed its wildlife. And we happen to know that those are enthusiasms of yours. So considering that specialness, do you see opportunities for Africa to develop, to industrialize alongside its environment that can be developed in ways we have not seen in other parts of the world?
I would say, David, that is even a must, because Africans come late to this game. Again, just not to repeat, they have to leapfrog. But in leapfrogging, they really can learn a lot from what is the right thing to do. For instance, I'm going to take the example of my little country, Guinea-Bissau, which is an amazingly biodiverse country. So when the government started discussing what should be done in terms of structural transformation for Guinea-Bissau, they asked my advice, and I went there and sat with the policymakers on a retreat, and we had a very long discussion, and eventually that made emerge a plan that unfortunately, because of political instability, has not been implemented so far. And the plan was all about making Guinea-Bissau a biodiverse jewel, because that was the most important ingredient for the transformation of the country. And people say, what is the link with industrialization? Because we tend to think industrialization always in terms of manufacturing first. But in fact, industrialization is about modernizing. It's bringing the economy to the industrial era of transactions and relations, more formal. So we have less informality. We have the capabilities of, basically providing a social contract that is much more enhanced than what exists in terms of subsistence and informality that people live out of right now. And for that, we need a modern economic structure. In that modern economic structure, in a country like that, it's about sustainable tourism. That's industrialization. And making sure that, with eco resorts and so on, you can take advantage of the opportunities offered by nature. The same in terms of fisheries. The way fisheries can help a country is very different from the way it is exploited right now. We have these agreements with the European Union, each one of the coastal countries in Africa that basically are exhausting the seas. And there is no need to go that route if you actually have introduction of aquaculture, different types of industrialization that actually protects the biodiversity. So it's always possible to link the two.
Hello. You mentioned that the last chapter of your book was about the role of China in transforming Africa. Can you just briefly explain how you see that playing out?
First, I try to correct the perception that we are very important for China. I think China is very important for Africa, but the reciprocal view is missing. I think for China, Africa is just a reservoir of sorts. Because if you see, for instance, in terms of foreign direct investment, outward foreign direct investment, Africa represents about 4% of Chinese foreign direct outward investment. That is as much as Pakistan. The entire continent receives as much as Pakistan. So that puts things into perspective when it comes to investment. When it comes to trade, it is true that the trade dimensions have evolved over time, and we now say China is number one African trade partner. As a country, yes, but if you take the EU 28, soon 27, we don't know, it's much more important than China by far. But what is fascinating is that what is our place in terms of being a trading partner to China? And Africa is like number 17 as a continent. Whereas for Europe, we are number 3 after the US and China. We are the 3rd trading partner of Europe. Europe is number 1 for us. We are number 3 for them. And I think that tells you that the relationship and the partnerships have to be shaped in a very different way from what the debate right now is offering. The other very important aspect that I bring in the book is the African agency in its relationship with China, because less talked about is the fact that China receives foreign direct investment from Africa, that China has a very large African community living in one of their cities, Guangzhou, that basically serves as the most important link for a lot of trading relations with the continent. And I've revisited some of the other aspects that are quite interesting. For instance, the fact that now you have 6 African airlines that fly to China, and only last year China for the first time started flying to Africa. So there is some agency on the part of the Africans. And for those who don't know, the largest enterprise in Africa is Naspers, based in Cape Town, which is basically an IT communications group that invests in different parts of the world. And one of their assets is in Tencent, which is the 3rd largest IT company in China. And just out of that investment, they have a capitalization of about $120 billion, which is, in terms of size and importance, I'm not comparing apples and oranges, just to give you sort of reasoning about the agency of the Africans. In terms of size, is like, 5 times what China invests in Africa per year. So we have to put things a bit in perspective.
Thank you. Question there. And question at the back and then one.
So thank you for the really interesting talk. And I'm interested that you say there was this demographic dividend keeps coming up on the youngest continent and so forth. And I'm curious to hear if you have examples of how countries have worked towards setting up the education sector to be able to handle this industrialization, and if at all there's anything happening in that space, or will it still be a lot of imported ideas, imported thoughts, imported technologies?
Yes, some countries are very much aware of the fact that they need to prepare their youth for the jobs of the future, not for the jobs of today. For instance, Ethiopia has decided to have universities across the country. You can question the quality of those universities, but the bottom line is this. They have the lowest urbanization in the continent, 20%. And that is because, they basically decentralized their education system. Now, also very interesting, they are now building some of the most innovative industrial parks. They have started with one in Awassa, now they are doing in different parts of the country. The total number of parks planned are 12. Each one of these parks is next to a university, one of those universities across the country, outside Addis. Only one is in Addis, actually. Now, I'm quite familiar with the Awassa Industrial Park, which was the first one, because it has been the subject of a lot of studies, including from many people here in Oxford, because of its fascinating combination of innovations. Some not yet to the point where you can judge whether they were successful or not, but everybody's accompanying them very closely. And I really find it fascinating that, the University of Awassa, that shares a wall with the industrial park, so it's really a neighbor, has been reoriented in terms of its offering to basically correspond to the needs of the park. You have, it's a park specialized on textiles, so you have people that are doing chemistry because they work with the colors and the coloring and so on. You have people that are textile experts, all kinds of things relating to the employability of those people. And we can say that Ethiopia has been very successful so far in attaining at least two things that we can measure. One is reducing the fertility rate. Second, reducing urbanization. That is quite significant, coming from the second largest population in the continent, And I think it's a good example. But we have other examples. In Rwanda and Mauritius, they are introducing universities that are so innovative and so different from anything that has been experimented so far, not just in the continent, even worldwide, like this Africa Leadership Academy has now produced one of the Africans to be recognized in the Time magazine, 100 most famous, influential people. The value of that is what it is. I mean, I'm not giving too much importance to it, but I know the gentleman. It's Fred Swaniker. He's a Ghanaian, and he's really quite impressive by bringing completely different ways of understanding the role of higher education. But someone dreaming is fine, but when he gets the backup that he's getting from the likes of the president of Rwanda or the government of Mauritius, it's something to take notice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Isha Pushito Al-Mustafa. I'm a doctoral student in Remote Business School. Thank you, Professor Carlos. My question is two. I don't know whether you can give me two questions. And the first question is on MDG and SDGs. In the course of your talk, I'm afraid you are not specific, that it appears no statistics on how many African countries attain MDG fully before the transition to SDGs. My question is this. On the course of your work, Nigeria is a key African country, which I'm afraid MDG was a very critical policy of the previous government, and the current Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, was the head of the MDG goals. What do you see is wrong in Nigerian concepts in terms of MDG attainment? That's the key question. Second question, Nigeria is an oil-rich nation. It's known globally. but it appears the oil money received appears not to help the poor to a certain extent. And policy, IMF regulation policy, subsidy issue, less functional refineries, issues with a bit of not transparency in the oil industry. In the course of your work, what do you see is wrong with Nigeria in terms of diversifying the economy so that the unemployment, which is critical at this current time, now is 23% as we speak. And then, is there anything you can speak about Nigeria, positive way and the negative aspects? Thank you so much.
Well, of course, I follow Nigeria very closely because being the largest economy in the continent, its influence is immense, but also because it's the largest country in terms of population. So both are reasons for being quite curious about everything that happens in Nigeria. And I must say also because Nigeria has incredible talent and innovation in many areas, like for instance, creative industries that are one way of defining sort of the future. Nigeria is by far the most talented African country, to the point that, surprise, surprise, in the rebasing exercise, the contribution of creative industries for GDP has surpassed agriculture. So it's something that people normally don't know. So definitely Nigeria is very important in many respects. When it comes to the MDGs, I think all countries in Africa have adopted the MDGs as their sort of policy because it was still the time, we are talking about early part of this century, first decade, it was still the time where a lot of the policy debate was around what was agreed with the donors. Even countries that don't depend on donors, Nigeria doesn't depend on donors, still were influenced by that policy debate. So for instance, the main institution in the African Union dealing with economic issues is not by mistake, it's called the New Partnership for African Development, New Economic Partnership for African Development, NEPAD. Partnership word is there, so it's like we can't define the policies of development of the continent without the partnership, meaning the donorship, because that's what is meant. And everything was about how this compact that I mentioned is going to work. We deliver good governance and receive support. And the support could come in different ways, one of which would be through concessional lending. What people don't realize is that concessional lending in the late part of the 90s and concessional lending today has not increased significantly in size. But economies have more than doubled. So what was available in terms of concessional lending then and what is today is diminishing significantly in relation to the size of the economies. Therefore, countries have to go and contract debt or find other ways of financing their development. And part of it has to be through, increased efficiency of their fiscal machinery. So fiscal pressure in Africa being so low, if you don't collect taxes because you don't modernize the economy, you are going to be dependent on debt, or you are going to be dependent on foreign direct investment if you can be attractive enough to get it. Or you forget about all that I just said, and here comes Nigeria, and you live out of the rent of your product that is sort of your gift from God, in this case, oil. The problem with that is that it becomes like a vicious circle. You depend so much on oil that your public revenue is almost all based on oil. And therefore, when the oil prices go down, your public revenues suffer. Part of those public revenues you use actually to subsidize oil consumption, because the refined oil, you don't refine it, you import it, So you have to subsidize it. And we end up, with this difficulty that countries that tend to depend too much on a commodity don't reform enough in terms of having other sources of public revenue. And this is the problem with Nigeria, and it's a problem with Angola, it's a problem with a number of countries. If you go into the list of the most reform-minded countries, you'll find that it's not a coincidence. Those who are leading the pack are not natural resources rich, because they had to find another way. And the others are now nicely following that lead. If you don't have your own resources, how are you going to implement the MDGs? You are going to implement it partly with lip service, because you don't have the revenues. And it doesn't matter how brilliant and mindful those in charge of the MDGs are, if the structure of the economy doesn't change, we are not going to make the dent that is needed for the kind of aspirations that are in the MDGs, now in the SDGs. So it's not specific to Nigeria, what I'm saying, but it definitely applies to Nigeria.
So we just have time for a last question. Chris.
Thanks very much for the fascinating talk. In discussions about development in Africa over the last 10 years or so, the same success stories have been named again and again. It's Botswana, it's Rwanda, you mentioned Mauritius, which is a tiny island, of course. Over the next 10 years, are we going to hear the same names over again, or do you see other countries coming to the fore? And if so, which ones and why?
Well, I can expand your list. I would include a number of other countries that are really making incredible changes in terms of their economic policy. I will include in that list, countries like Morocco, that has accelerated its industrialization, has very coherent policies for industrialization, is doing quite significant transformations right now. I can include countries like Djibouti and Togo, small countries, but with ports that have become huge logistical centers. Djibouti now the largest port in East Africa, and Lomé the largest port in West Africa. I can include countries like other small islands like Cape Verde, that is growing at more than 5%. I can include countries like Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Ghana, that are actually very consequential in their reforms and are changing completely their infrastructure and the way they are dealing with it. And I would include countries that are not doing very well in terms of economic growth, but are transforming, like Namibia. And the reason they are not having a very significant economic growth is because they are part of a customs union with South Africa, and South African economy not growing enough. They are penalized significantly in terms of the value of the rand and the way their transactions depend so much on South Africa. So my list is growing. Now, what I think is important is for us to bear in mind that in the last 24 months, we had 19 changes of leaders in Africa. That means almost one per month. You guess the rest.
Thanks very much, Carlos. The visitor program at
The Martin School is due to the generosity of Lillian Martin, who gave us a gift to endow it. And Lillian wanted us to be enabled to bring some of the world's leading thinkers on solution-oriented ideas and research to Oxford and to the school. And you can see in Carlos our perfect visitor. Thank you so much for coming back and launching your book here. For those of you who want to buy the book, we have plenty of copies outside, with the added benefit of it being signed by Carlos as well. So please do come and join us for a glass of wine to talk further to Carlos, and join me in thanking Carlos for a fabulous talk.
Thank you.